This video is an introduction to Chapter 6, Cellular Respiration. Cellular respiration is a process by which a cell breaks down a molecule of glucose, meaning it breaks apart sugar, to release energy so that the cell has usable energy to do a job. That job might be manufacturing protein, might be replicating DNA so that the cell can reproduce. It might be pumping things in and out of the membrane. It might be moving the cell from point A to point B. Regardless of the job, the cell will require energy. That energy comes from sugar and it gets converted into usable energy called ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Tri meaning three, meaning that there are three phosphates attached in a molecule of ATP. You can see that pictured down here on the lower right. There are three phosphates attached to the molecule. As you can see, those phosphates all are negatively charged. In general, negative charges do not want to be by each other. They will repel each other. So those bonds that are holding the phosphates together are called high energy bonds, meaning they store a lot of energy, meaning that when that bond breaks between the phosphates, a huge amount of energy gets released that the cell will use to do some kind of job. The way that a cell makes ATP is by breaking down glucose. That is a very intricate process, which we will go into more next week. You'll be expected to know a lot of details about that. But the energy to jam those phosphates together comes from sugar, comes from glucose. ATP gets reused in the cell. Here we have a molecule of ATP that contains three phosphates. When the cell is consuming a large amount of sugar, the amount of ATP in the cell will drastically go up because the cell is getting a lot of energy from all that sugar, so it's making a lot of ATP. The cell will then store that ATP for when it needs that energy. When the cell needs that energy, a phosphate bond gets broken and that phosphate molecule gets attached to another molecule in the cell. Generally, it's getting attached to a protein. Since that little phosphate has a negative charge, when that phosphate attaches to a protein, it will cause a shape change in the protein. To remind you, proteins are intricately folded. They're folded so hydrophobic regions point in, hydrophilic regions point out. Positive amino acids are oriented toward negative amino acids. If now I am bringing in a new negative charge that's going to attach to that protein, it can change the shape of that protein because now maybe a positive amino acid over here that was attracted to this negative is now going to be attracted to the negative coming in. The shape change of the protein when the phosphate is added will allow that protein to do a new job that it couldn't do with its old shape. When the cell is done doing that job, the phosphate would break off of that protein and would be a free phosphate that the cell could then reattach if a new molecule of sugar comes in. The molecule on the bottom here is called ADP because it is a diphosphate containing two phosphates as opposed to three, which is a triphosphate. So that phosphate molecule that breaks off of ATP attaches to a protein, allowing the cell to do a job that it couldn't do before. When the job is finished, the phosphate will be removed from that protein, and if there is sugar available, it will get reattached to ADP to return itself to an energy storing molecule called ATP. So this is a cyclical process where the cell recycles particles as opposed to just throwing away them as trash. When that phosphate gets broken off of ATP and gets added onto a protein, giving the protein a new shape and thus also energy that was stored in the bond, we call that phosphorylation, meaning it got a phosphate added to it. So my protein, shown here, gets a phosphate from ATP, and I would now call it a phosphorylated protein, meaning it is energized. It has energy to do a job that it couldn't do before. ADP is released kind of like as garbage, but when the protein is done doing its job, that phosphate can get reattached to ADP to make ATP. This intro segment is just about what is ATP, what does the molecule look like, and how is energy stored in the bonds between phosphates. You'll now do the ATP packet where you'll see that in more detail. Then next week we will go into more details than you ever dreamed of about how ATP gets made.